from the distance of nearly a millennium later, it's a little hard to define or prove the causes of the economic revival. We know that there was one, but it's not easy to demonstrate why it happened. But one of the things we do know is that around the year 1000, the climate began to warm. Now, today we talk about global warming as if it's a terrible thing that, it's all people's fault for having not controlled greenhouse gases and things like that. But in fact, scientists have always known, or have known for centuries, that the Earth goes through gradual warming and cooling periods all on its own. We're not quite sure why this happens, but we know that it does that because we can look at, for instance, tree rings from trees that have been growing for centuries, and we can see that there were periods when the trees had warmer weather and were able to grow faster and things like that. In terms of human history, this global warming had several effects on, we can assume it had several effects on European culture, and a couple of the things that we can assume it did was that in the south, in the land near the Mediterranean, it was warmer for a longer period of time, and therefore people were able to grow two crops. Like I told you about before, you could grow a summer crop and a winter crop, so you had more food. Also, in the north, there had been land which was either not able to be farmed or only marginally able to be farmed because the weather was not warm for a sufficiently long period of time for people to be able to do their growing. And now it was warm in those northern areas. There were still problems in terms of growing food in the north because although in the land near the Mediterranean, it had been fairly easy to plow this land because it was kind of loose, and actually a human being could just take a hoe out there and plow up the land by hand. In the north, it wasn't so easy because for centuries there had been this cold, wet climate, and the earth had become dense and relatively hard and not capable of being plowed by human beings. So we had to invent, for instance, the heavy plow, which had a big iron-covered tooth that could dig deep into the ground and pull the ground up and turn it over, which was then considered necessary in order for effective planting to take place. Of course, we have the problem that it's very hard to pull the plow through this dense, peaty soil. A human being cannot do it by himself. An ox could do it, one of those big, broad-shouldered, cow-type animals. And, all you really needed to do was throw a rope around, a noose around the ox's neck, because oxes have big, strong collarbones. But an ox is very slow. And also, the advantage to using a horse was that, for one thing, the horse had a lot more energy and could plow a lot more land in the same amount of time. But also, you could use a horse to take surplus crops to market, which was what people were beginning to do more and more. So a horse became more advantageous to do this kind of work. However, horses did not have big, strong collarbones. If you threw a lasso around a horse's neck and expected the horse to pull a heavy plow, the horse would strangle himself, or at least not have as much air to provide himself with so that he could do the work that he was capable of doing. So another thing that needed to be invented was the horse collar, which was a big padded kind of necklace kind of arrangement that you would put around the horse's neck so you could use the horse to plow the field and then take the horse collar off, and the horse could pull a cart. I guess you would put the horse collar on before so you could pull the cart, and then take the surplus crops to market. And there were surplus crops to take to market. The fact that you could grow crops for 2 seasons in the south and grow crops in the north in places where you hadn't been able to grow crops before um, means that you have more food, which means, for one thing, that people have more babies, because you don't have babies if you can't afford to feed them. But if you've got enough food to feed your children, you have more babies, because that means more people that you can use to work on your farm. Um, Also, you, after having fed yourself and your family and your new babies, you still have stuff left over, which you can take to a market and sell that for money. Well, at the beginning there's no money, but as you have more people able to trade abroad, and I'll bring that up in a minute, money begins coming back into Europe, and you begin to have the revival of a what they call a currency economy that's based on buying things with gold and silver coins. You begin to have gold and silver coins available again. Therefore, the people who are able to sell their surplus crops can have money now, money that they don't need right away, which economists refer to as capital. In fact, there is a famous 19th century economic book by Karl Marx, which is called Capital, because he thinks it's the most important thing in the economy, at least the capitalist economy. That's why they call it a capitalist economy. Capital is money that you don't need to spend right away. You don't need to buy stuff that you will be using for the next few weeks. So you can put that money into a venture that will, over the long term, give you an economic return. But you're not going to be getting that money in the short term. So it has to be money that you don't need to use right away. There are other things that result from the food surplus. For one thing, not everybody in Europe has to be growing food. Back in the Dark Ages, you had practically everybody growing food, because otherwise there wouldn't be enough food to go around. But now that there are longer growing seasons in the south, more farms in the north, there's more food, and the farmers, you have a smaller proportion of the population that has to be farming. So you can have some people undertaking other kinds of occupations. This wouldn't have been possible if everybody had to be growing their own food, but now you've got people who are selling their surplus food, and other people who can buy that food and use it to feed themselves while they are doing other kinds of business. For instance, a blacksmith shop or a carpenter shop or something like that, because people have accumulated capital by means of selling surplus crops. You can use that capital. If you decide you don't want to be a farmer anymore, you can start a blacksmith shop and use their capital to set up a blacksmith shop, because you have to have a lot of money to build a blacksmith shop and get all the equipment together and your forge and your anvil and everything like that before you can even start to be a blacksmith. So this is one of the reasons you have to have capital, money that you don't need to use right away, but that you can use to invest in a business that will give you a long-term return. Or, for instance, if you are a merchant, you could use this money to buy quantities of goods that you could take to other countries. I pointed out earlier that most of these foreign countries did not need agricultural stuff because they were able to produce their own crops. But now that you've got people going into businesses, blacksmiths and things like that, you do begin to produce manufactured items that people might be able to need abroad. However, when you take those manufactured items abroad, you are not going to get your money back immediately. You have to at least give it time to get to the place where you're going to be selling it. So again, you need to have money that you don't need to use in the short term, but that will give you a long-term return. And you could buy goods and take them to places like, Afghanistan, that kind of thing, and sell them and then get money back, which you could bring back to Europe and then reinvest or spend on booze or whatever you wanted to do. So you've got people springing up in places where they need to have large quantities of customers in the area. You can't move your blacksmith shop around from place to place. You have to put your blacksmith shop in a place where there will be a lot of people in the neighborhood who will be able to come to you. And the best way to do this is to locate your shop in a town or a city. Towns and cities had not been very numerous during the Dark Ages. People had been out living on their manors, where they'd been using their peasants to farm the land. But now that there are ways of making other money besides agriculture and surplus food that you can buy in the town market in order to feed yourself, because you are no longer growing your own food as a farmer, but you are being a blacksmith or something like that, you can set up in a city and you can make the money that you would be making as the person who is running a city type business. Another thing that happens, you've got these people who are going into business in the cities and making a lot of money. They're in fact making a lot more money than the lords and the manors are. And a lot of these craftsmen and merchants in the city end up having so much money that the lords, if they want to go to war or something like that and want to be able to pay soldiers, which now they can do again because there is a currency economy in place, the lords have to borrow money from the artisans and merchants in the towns. So these people have a certain amount of political leverage, and they can go to the lord and say, look, you've been calling all the shots up to this point and telling people what to do, but we want to be able to form a city government and pass laws and have a certain amount of control over our own situation. And if you don't let us do this, we are not going to loan you that money that you need to go on to your next war. So you have cities called communes. This is not like the later commune that has to do with communism, but it's the cities are able to be governed not by members of the nobility, but by people who today we would call maybe members of the middle class, people who have earned their living by work, but now have a certain amount of money that they can use to give themselves a social position. So that's a good thing for the middle class, and it's also the beginning of what we would call modern government, government by the people, for the people, blah, blah, blah. Although, of course, the only people who have power in the Middle Ages are still wealthy people. The servants and the people working in the fields still don't have any political power at all. Now, another thing that happens, you've got these craftsmen who are working in the cities, the blacksmiths and the carpenters and things like that. And I pointed out that in the Middle Ages, you don't have any sense that prices are determined by the free market economy the way we do now, the law of supply and demand. They don't understand it as operating that way. Their idea is you make a certain amount of, you put a certain amount of work into making a good or a product, and then you sell it for the appropriate price. And you don't want competition, which will affect your ability to sell your manufactured product for the price that you think it's worth. So craftsmen in a particular field, all the carpenters in town or all the blacksmiths in town, gather together to form mutual assistance societies, you might say, called guilds, Guilds, although sometimes it's spelled without a U. Apparently these started out as just sort of societies for the mutual benefit of the people who belong to them. If one of the members of the guild died, then the other members of the guild would take up a collection to pay for the funeral and support the widow and the children. But then the guilds begin to think, we can band together. And because we have political power, we can go to the Lord and say, okay, we want to pass a law saying that if you're going to be a carpenter in this town, you have to belong to the Carpenters Guild. If you want to be a blacksmith, you have to belong to the Blacksmiths Guild. If you want to be any kind of craftsman, you have to belong to the appropriate guild of craftsmen. And if you don't belong, you can't run your business in town, and we can drive you out. So, to be continued in our next.